She has made incredibly important contributions to the field from a research perspective, and I think one thing I'd like to highlight in particular is I think a very important contribution that she and her group have made in the clinical trial landscape is economic evaluations are now being embedded within clinical trials, and it's now a very recognized and important part of the data that are collected with clinical trials so that these issues can be evaluated prospectively. And really the work of her and her group in collaboration with the NCIC, but also work that she does with governments and other stakeholders has really been critically important. She's a leader in this field and has really put Canada on the map in terms of the contribution they can make to some of these very important cooperative group studies that are being done in CLL and other obviously in other diseases. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Mittman.
Take out someone's eye. Thank you very much. Good morning. I am humbled by the fact that this is a Saturday morning on a beautiful day where it's actually sunny, and it may look like spring instead of fall, and that there are so many people in the room. So thank you very much, and thank you for the organizing committee for the opportunity to talk a little bit about economics. I don't know what the right answer is. I'm just going to talk about some of the reasons we have economic analysis and why some drugs are put through the process of not only thinking that they're drugs that work, but then how expensive are they. And I'm also going to give you some of the tools and some of the language so that when you go and talk to your decision makers or your policy people in your various provinces or jurisdictions, or I heard that there are a number of people from outside of the Canadian market, you can actually start to talk to them with knowledge. So that's my goal for today. So this is me, and we've already been introduced to me, lots of different things, but I have lots of disclosures, and I always indicate that I've worked with everybody and their brother. So anyone from an industry perspective, from a government perspective, or from an academic perspective. Economics, and with respect to drugs, has always been a hot topic, or at least within the last 5 years, where budgets aren't changing too much, and new and expensive therapies are coming out. People are very interested in looking at the economic evaluations of new products. Oh, I see another, is that like a little, oh, there we go. Thank you. So here's a slide that talks about access to medications, so which countries have the best access to medications. I'm sure those are some of the questions that you're asking yourselves. So talking about some of the European countries having best access to medications, and then Canada, which I think I have a pointer, hold on, without taking someone's eye out, and I can't really see it, but I'm assuming it's up there. So Canada is there as one of the countries that doesn't have as good access as people would like to medications. So why is that? And so it's not about the evidence. Remember, anyone who does a clinical trial, participates in a clinical trial, and sees the results of a clinical trial, those are the same results in every country, right? So it's not that Canada sees different clinical trial results than the US after they're looking at a particular study. What's interesting and what's different is often how they're funded. So here's the neat part, that this is what's happened in the CLL world lately. This is FDA approval. We'll talk a little bit about the Canadian approval in some upcoming slides, but just gives you that over, within a 1.5 year span, fantastic amounts of therapies have been made available. And these have been approved through the FDA system, and we're usually about a year, maybe 18 months behind for some drugs, but just to give you a little bit of an idea of agents that are out there on the market. And this changes, and so because of some of the results that they have, it's revolutionized potentially the way you manage CLL. But the issue is that some of these drugs, where you've gone from $500 or $5,000 a year therapy to something like potentially $100,000 a year therapy. So how do we deal with that? And keeping in mind that these drugs do offer some sort of benefit. So we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to do some math. okay? I know it's Saturday morning. I know nobody likes math, but we're going to do some math. And by the end, you're going to understand a little bit about some of the math involved. I'm going to provide you with an overview of economic evaluations. I'm going to give you sort of an overview of the drug reimbursement process that we have here, at least in the Canadian system. And we can talk, and for question periods, we can talk about potential other systems. And we're going to talk about what kinds of information do these drug reimbursement systems need when they're making their decision. So here's the math part, okay? It really comes down to three things: differences, ratios, and ranking. Can everybody say that with me? This is an interactive presentation. Differences, ratios, ranking, okay? And then now you're all experts in economics, okay? So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the things that we're going to talk about, okay? So we're going to come back to the slide a few times because we want to keep you awake on this Saturday morning. And we're going to make you say differences, ratios. Awesome. Okay, we're going to come back to this a few times. So in Canada, and I apologize to those of you who are outside of the Canadian space, but we have sort of different levels of coverage for medications. We talk about our universal healthcare system, but really we have sort of 4 different buckets of how medications get funded in our country. So there's the government or publicly funded system. There's this private or the employer insurance system where if you're employed, then you have some sort of benefit plan potentially. There's a private system where patients or individuals actually go out and purchase their own kind of insurance. And then if there's no insurance available, it's out of pocket. Okay, so really when we think about our healthcare system, that's the way it really falls out. But when people really think about the Canadian healthcare system, they always think about this man, Tommy Douglas. So Tommy Douglas is the most influential Canadian for any of you who ever listen to CBC, the CBC polls always ask who's the most influential Canadian, and it's always Tommy Douglas is always number one, not Wayne Gretzky. It's really always Tommy Douglas. And why? Because he is the father of universal healthcare. He was in Saskatchewan. He ended up finding out that people who became sick were often hospitalized, and if they were farmers, they lost farms because they couldn't afford to be in the hospital and they couldn't run their farms. And he thought it would be not ethical for anyone to lose any sort of livelihood because of healthcare. And so this is the father of healthcare. For those of you who are in the media space, so Kiefer Sutherland, who's an actor, this is his grandfather. Okay, so when I tell the students, they still look at me and they say, "Who's Kiefer Sutherland?" It's like, okay, we're out. We're out. But this gives you a little bit of an idea. So this is when we think about the Canadian healthcare system, we talk about universal access. But reality is when Tommy Douglas came and put this sort of scheme together from the Canadian environment, we didn't have drugs like we have today. We didn't have expensive therapies. We had hospitalizations, we had emergency rooms. So drugs weren't often included in that kind of universal healthcare scheme. And so that's why different provinces often make different decisions and rules about this. So here's another thing that makes us famous. For those of you who have your cell phone and use little emojis, apparently Canadians are unique enough that they use the poop emoji more than any other country. So that also makes us unique aside from the universal healthcare system. I'm not sure why. I don't think I've ever thought about using it, but well, I'll ask my children who are all teenagers and ask them why they would think that that's important. So here's why we start thinking about economics. So this is a study that was actually published through the Canadian Institute for Health Information, and they talked that the average Canadian spent about $200,000 in their lifetime on healthcare. Okay, this is an average Canadian, no disease-specific kind of idea. But when we think about, so how much of that do we spend? So those of you who pay taxes, it's tax deadline next week, right, for Canadians, and so just thinking about, at least from an Ontario space, if for every dollar that I give in taxes, 42 cents goes to healthcare, okay? So that's not roads, that's not infrastructure, that's not education, it's not anything else but healthcare. So that's 42 cents out of every dollar that I give the government. So you'd like them to spend it wisely, right? You'd like them to actually make good decisions about that money that you're entrusting them with. So this is just the Ontario expenditures by category of types of expenditures. The big purple or blue at the bottom is healthcare. This is how it looks at it over time. It looks at it by different sectors. The next one, which is that sort of browny poopy color, is the education, and then it goes on into different kind of infrastructure sectors. But it gives you an idea that there's lots of money spending on healthcare. It's not that your decision makers don't care about health. They actually spend a fair bit of money out of your tax dollars on healthcare. So the idea is to decide, how do we do that properly? So, and yesterday on Thursday, we had the budget came down in Ontario at least, and there were no increases to the healthcare system, only with respect to home care. And so really that means that there really isn't much room to move. Whenever you hear about how much public dollars there are, does that mean you want to pay, 50 cents on the dollar of every healthcare? Do you want to spend $1 of every dollar that you give to them on healthcare? So just thinking a little bit about that, the roads that you drove to get here, and all those kinds of things that people have to make decisions on. So this is the drug program utilization, though, they expect to actually increase. And we know why, because there are new therapies that are coming out. Fantastic time to be alive and have access to these kinds of therapies. But how do we manage that, and how do we actually get access to these therapies? So here's a study that was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, in their Open Journal, and this started to look at what is the cost of cancer. And this is Claire d'Oliveira, who actually is at the University of Toronto, looked at the various publicly funded administrative data sets. So anytime you have a health card in any province and you use your health card to go to the hospital or the emergency room, that data actually goes into administrative type data, and you can actually look at that information. So she started to look at different cancers and actually looked at individuals, looked at different disease sites across the board. And I recognize that a lot of these are solid tumors, but there are some hematological malignancies within there, and I think we can see those. So there's leukemia and lymphoma, but it gives you an idea that on the y-axis, can't really point to it. On the y-axis is the cost in a year, and on the x-axis are the various diseases. So you can start to see how much really some of these diseases are cost, and she split them by individuals who lived longer than a year and individuals who didn't live as long as 1 year. So just to give you an idea, when we start to look at those individuals who didn't live as long, we actually see that those are high burden kinds of diseases from a cost point of view. And these are only publicly funded dollars, right? This is what comes from the healthcare system information, your public system. So it doesn't talk about private insurance, it doesn't talk about out-of-pocket insurance or out-of-pocket funding as well, but this gives you a little bit of a snapshot about distribution. So any payer who's looking towards new therapies will actually start to have to look at the burden of the disease. And then one of the other things that she did was start to look at, well, what are the kinds of health system resources people are using? We'll talk about that as one of the metrics coming up. But she actually had this lovely pie graph that talked about what are the biggest kind of cost drivers. And if I can try and do it from here. So we have hospitalization is really the biggest cost driver. And if you look at drugs, they're a small portion. I think there's some. 1 second. 1 second, I'll get back there. And looking at drugs are somewhere around here where we actually start to think about, well, how much of that component is drugs? So that just gives you a snapshot. This is the kind of thing that people who do health economics start to look at. What are the burden of the diseases? What are the kinds of variables that are affected? So is it hospitalization? Is it emergency? Is it physician? What are the actual cost drivers? So here's our math, right? Remember what we said? What are the three things? Yay! Okay, here we go. So just as a reminder, okay, we'll get to the math. So why is economics important? And so we saw a little bit about the various public sector pieces where there is an increase. Sometimes there isn't an increase, but it just in general, the private and the public system have been increasing. It's not necessary to look at the actual numbers, but the shape and the direction, right? So it's actually going up. So this is what we sort of need to think about. And because it's going up, how do we understand and use and manage that 42 cents on every dollar wisely? So, and what happens is our health systems then have these finite funding envelopes. You only have 42 cents on the dollar for every person. And so how much money do we have? And how much money can we spend? And if we only have so much money, how do we spend it? Well, so often people think, well, we just make decisions on spending for medications. And there could be many different reasons for making a decision to fund in favor of a medication and not to fund. And they could be as simple as looking at clinical outcomes, which is almost always, a driver of good outcomes. Looking at the cost might play a role. Looking at the disease itself, so maybe there hasn't been any changes in it or haven't been any therapies that have been good in a long time. Maybe there's the number of people who are affected is huge, is a huge burden. The patient might have an influence there, or you have a feeling you want to think that this is a good thing to fund. But really, there's some evidence or some guidelines that look at the management. And I think one of the things is that you can make a decision about funding a drug or getting access to a drug using all of these components, but there has to be some sort of systematic way to actually evaluate it so that there isn't a bias, right? So one of the things that people have started to look at is when a drug comes out that you have some sort of efficacy and safety, that the next thing that governments actually look for is not only is it effective, but is it cost effective? And they do this using some tools, which I'm going to show you in a little bit. So here's the standard kind of process. You have a randomized clinical trial, and then you have a good outcome, and the patient gets access to it. That's the ideal situation, right? So everybody has access to that particular agent. In reality, there are some blocks along the way. But keeping in mind, it's the same evidence across each of the provinces or jurisdictions that you're in. That clinical trial evidence doesn't change. What does change is sometimes how different jurisdictions make decisions. So what is the purpose of a clinical trial? It's really to evaluate the effectiveness. So did it work? Did it and the safety? Did it make any harm any participants? Did it have complications, short-term, long-term kind of implications? So that's the purpose of having a clinical trial, and to see what the outcome is from an effectiveness point of view. And there are so many different types of outcomes. So you can imagine that your particular disease may have a very different outcome than another disease. And that the healthcare system isn't only looking at cancer, but they have other diseases to consider as well. So the fact that you have a clinical trial where you could have an overall survival outcome, you could have a progression-free survival outcome, you could have a tumor response outcome, and all trials have slightly different variations on these kind of outcomes. So what makes it hard for people who are then evaluating these particular agents for making reimbursement decisions is trying to actually streamline some of these outcomes. And so that you would have potentially an outcome that might be very different in your disease site than some solid tumor outcome may have. That you may have a very different outcome than a diabetic may have an outcome, or an antihypertensive drug that has an outcome. So often there's a challenge with how do you deal with these multiple outcomes, and sometimes they're outcomes like durable response, or outcomes that are long-term outcomes that you may not actually see within the clinical trial. So how does a decision maker actually deal with that? So this is what really happens. There's some sort of brick wall, which is a formulary, and the formulary is really just a list of drugs where you can have access, and I'm sure you all know that, but this is sort of what happens. You have a trial, and instead of actually getting access to the patient, you now have to show that not only does it have a clinical benefit, which you've shown in the clinical trial, but that it also is effective and cost effective. So for those of you can't have cost effectiveness, we often hear that terminology, without effectiveness. Okay? If the drug doesn't work, it's not going to be cost effective at all. So let's at least think about that. So there's new products that are always more expensive than older products. I don't think I've ever seen a new product that's been cheaper than the existing older standard of care kind of thing. They're more expensive, there are more prescriptions, there are more people who are potentially using them and getting access to them. So we're starting to think about we need to have economic evaluations. Here's our math component. Thank you. Thank you. Good. Thank you. So how are drugs approved, at least in the Canadian space, okay? So this looks very simple, doesn't it? This is a process by which our Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, or PCODR, looks at getting access to drugs. So this is our decision-making body in the Canadian space, and it's called Pan-Canadian because Quebec isn't involved in this process, but all the provinces are, with that exception. And so the whole idea is that a new drug has some sort of Health Canada approval, and then they go through a process of evaluating how good is the effectiveness also, and then how good is the cost effectiveness. Seems quite simple. So the reality is once they go through this process, and this is an older sort of table, but I give you a process of, remember I said that the efficacy was always the same from a clinical trial. It didn't matter if you were looking at that clinical trial result from Manitoba or looking at it from British Columbia. But what happens is decisions are often made differentially across the country. So here's just, this is an older slide, but it was a nicely illustrated slide that you have the drug name is on the left-hand column, and then the rows are actually the provinces, and then depending on if you have access to a drug or it's restricted or it's not yet evaluated or it's been actually rejected, it can actually change depending on where you live in the country, right? So it gives you, again, same evidence is just viewed differently, or the cost effectiveness is viewed differently. So the evidence is the same regardless of where you live. What's happening is how it is evaluated is quite different. So in a Canadian process, this is the way it happens. You have a drug development, which is fantastic. You end up getting this drug approval through the clinical trials process, and then you have this reimbursement system in there. For all the reasons that I talked to you about, we're increasing costs. We have no more cost dollars. We need to figure out how to do this wisely. So really, this is the preface for economic evaluation, and this is what I'm here for. So we have a number of agencies. I mentioned the PCODR agency. In Canada, we also have the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, of which now PCODR is part of. This is the decision-making body at a Canadian or federal level that evaluates the cost effectiveness of medications. And they take in all the evidence and put together an argument about whether or not a drug is cost effective or not. So it gives you a little bit of an idea that this is not something that's happening just on a bias. Remember that list of how do you make a decision? It's actually done in a systematic way. And we published many years ago, because we thought oncology was a specific type of disease that required extra guidance, we published actually economic guidelines for oncology products. So that means it stands a little bit different than somebody who is reviewing drugs for diabetes, or someone that, or decision makers that are reviewing drugs for hypertension. And we published this addendum, so this actually looks specifically at economic evaluations. So the PCODR part is the one group that has been around now for about 5 years, where any oncology product that now has a Health Canada approval can go through this process. So why was it created? I think there was really a need to have a clear review process. So not a biased review process, and something that was streamlined between the provinces. And the reason I showed you that slide, that was older data about access, the goal is that they actually make decisions at the PCODR level that then all the provinces will have access to that same decision-making process. And perhaps will hopefully make same decisions with respect to access, so that there's a consistent and clear process, and it improves the quality of the new cancer therapies and review process. So what kinds of recommendations does it make? Really sort of 3 kind of recommendations. It recommends that something could be approved, so as a drug that has a clear clinical benefit and clear economic benefit. It considers with condition, so a drug may have a clear benefit, but it's just maybe has the economic benefit, or the economic burden might be too high, or they do not recommend. So essentially they make sort of 3 kinds of recommendations after they go through their review process. What's interesting is the PCODR has created, as part of their decision-making body for all of you, a patient engagement guide. And they actually have patients who are on their decision-making body who can provide opinions and provide content expertise on the patient burden. So not only is it all about clinical efficacy or scientific efficacy or only economics, they actually now have patients who are actually on the decision-making body who actually can vote to make one of those 3 recommendations. So, in fact, Jeffrey Hotch, who's also at the University of Toronto, and a number of the people who are on the PCODER patient representative body actually published an article, and I have a reference for it at the end, talking about how meaningful it is to have patients actually at the decision-making table. So it's not necessarily all just about evidence and cost. It actually does have the patients actually do have an influence. So that the patients sort of value the choice of treatment. So that's the purpose of having these individuals on that committee, so that they actually can indicate that the burden of the disease, the burden to the family, and burden to other individuals. So here's what you need to know. So when you take away anything from this talk, you'll get to know some of the tools that those decision makers use to come up with a decision. So there are really kinds of 5 things that people need to think about. The perspective of the economic evaluation, the costs, the quality of life or the quality adjusted life year, and here's where our math will come in, these incremental analyses as well. So we'll talk a little bit about those and think about what are the kinds of things that payers, decision makers, whether it's a public payer or potentially even a private payer, are looking for. So let's think a little bit about the perspective. If you're a health system, are you worried about the health budget? So you're worried about the perspective. If you're a public payer, you're really interested in the healthcare system that you're funding. So that may be you're interested in the general kinds of costs around drugs and emergency room visits and hospital and nursing time and chair time, those kinds of things. You may not be, as depending on the perspective, be that interested in perhaps outside of the health system costs, so caregiver burden, family burden, out-of-pocket expenses, because that's not within your budget, for example, right? So often these economic analyses, the first thing that they need to do is describe to you what's the perspective of that evaluation. Is it a healthcare system or is it a societal perspective? And we can all agree that the societal perspective actually takes in many more factors than just the health system component. It can take in the influence of lost productivity, indirect costs, parking costs, all those kinds of things that are important when managing someone with a certain disease. So then we look at costs, and everybody who talks about economics always thinks, okay, that's it, the dollar sign. But really, that's the last thing that people start to think about. In order to figure out how much something costs, you need to figure out what's involved in the costing. So you need to identify what that health system, or whatever your perspective is, resource is. So is it how many times did you have to go to the clinic? How many times you had to visit the doctor? Or is it that you went into the emergency room for some sort of febrile neutropenia or complication? So one of the things that's important from a costing perspective is actually start to understand what are the costs in the management of individuals with that care under the umbrella of that perspective that you were looking at. So once you can identify what those resources are, then you have to figure out how to quantify them. So how many times did you see someone? How many lab tests did you do? How many CT scans did you have? So lots of work gets into identifying the appropriate resources, because if you don't identify them, you can't cost them. Right? And so also starting to look at how many. And then the last thing is once you've identified them, you've added in, you know how many of those resources are used, then you can start to cost them. So different types of cost, really depending on whatever system you're looking at. I just had a health system cost perspective when I put this slide together. You know, it could be anything from nursing to hospitalization to caregiver, right? So thinking about what points of the healthcare system do you touch as you're managing that individual. And maybe, for example, a new therapy may actually reduce, for example, hospital stay, or reduce the length of hospital stay, or reduce emergency room encounters. And so those are the reasons that often you take your new therapy and compare it to a standard therapy. What is different in the management of the new therapy compared to the old therapy? So it's not just the drug itself, but what else is considered in the resources and the management. The other thing that's really important about economic evaluations, we talked a lot about the different kinds of efficacy outcomes, so overall survival, progression-free survival. One of the things that our government has done is used something called a utility value. So one of the things that is very difficult to do, because remember, their 42 cents is for every disease, not just yours. And so one of the things that they're looking at is trying to streamline and make some sort of outcome that can cross the board of many diseases. So often they use something called a utility value, and it's almost like a quality of life measurement, for example. And so where it usually has is a scale between 0, where 0 is death, and 1 is perfect health. And depending on where you are in your condition or where you are in your health, you actually have a score between there. And then that score is transportable and comparable to, what if I fund this drug, but I also have another drug on the table which has different sort of utility measurements and different quality of life measurements. And these are sort of standardized metrics that are used. So this is a tool that is used so that the governments and decision makers can actually compare between diseases and compare between disease sites. So this is often what's used as a metric of evidence. So we put together a paper many years ago looking at utility scores in chronic or in community dwelling populations with chronic conditions. And just to give you a little bit of an idea, can we go back? This was the 20 diseases that people actually collected at that particular time. This is from the National Population Health Survey. Gives you a little bit of an idea of scale. So what is the average kind of utility value? Remember, it was between 0 and 1. And if you had, if I could show you, I'm scared to go around the corner, you might not hear me. The stroke part here, or urinary incontinence, and those have lower utility values than others. So just to give you an idea, and then this kind of work is done for every disease and every disease site. So one of the things that they do with that utility value, because you think, oh, that's like a quality of life measure, they actually they look at that measurement and they look at how much time you spend in that state. So for example, this quality adjusted life year. So any of you who have ever looked at any economic evaluation, this is the kind of thing you need to think about, is the quality adjusted life year. And this is what your payers are looking for. They take that generic utility value and multiply it by the amount of time. So it's a marriage of morbidity and mortality. Okay? And so like 1 year of a disease is a fraction of a healthy year. And that's really what you saw in that other graph where they had where did those other diseases fall. And so that is often used as the metric to say, what's the cost effectiveness, where effectiveness is this quality adjusted life year. Okay, so this is, I always show this graph, and my husband's always mad at me when I show it. So this is assuming that I only have a 4-year time horizon, but I start off in perfect health when I'm single, and then I get married at year 1, and I go down in health, and then I have children, and I go down again. And then they go off to university, right? So, but it gives you a little bit of an idea. So you can imagine that if you started out with perfect health and then something happened to you, had a diagnosis, that you would change your utility value, right? And that if something then had a complication or you ended up having some sort of adverse event, then that could also change your utility value. So one of the things that decision makers are very happy about doing and very interested in doing is measuring the amount of time you spend in these kind of health states. And so that's what they use as a metric for making decisions. They also the other thing you can talk about is lost productivity, the fact that you're not productive on a Monday. I didn't even have Saturday on here, but we're very productive today. And gives you a little bit of an idea of other things that they may consider depending on the perspective of the analysis. So here's something that actually is an online tool through the PCODER, or the Pan-Canadian Drug or Oncology Drug Review process. Talks about how do costs and benefits fit into this process. So here's where our math comes in. All right, so here's the first part. We're going to have a drug, and we talk about drug A, and it has a lifetime cost of $87,000, compared to some sort of standard drug or standard of care or no existing therapy or a watch and wait therapy, whatever the comparator is that you're looking at. And this is $83,000. So remember the first math thing? Difference, right? Here's the difference. So this is our difference is about almost $4,000 between the drugs. And remember, it's not just the drug cost. They were talking about lifetime cost. So what they ended up doing is looking at the management of individuals who have that certain disease with the drug, any exposure to emergency rooms or hospitalizations or chair time or adverse events. That all came into that number that was rolled up into this $87,000. So here's the difference. So they start to look at the difference in the costs of two therapies. This is what decision makers are doing. The next thing they want to look at is, okay, so now we know the difference in cost. What's the difference in the effectiveness? So remember that quality adjusted life year that I told you a little bit about? This is where here you have two drugs with different quality adjusted life years, right? They have different utility values over different amounts of time, and they have a total lifetime quality adjusted life year. And this, what you're also doing is looking at the difference between those two, okay? So here's where the next one comes in. Remember, what was the next one? Ratio. All right. So then you do some very simple math, and you say, what's the difference? This is what decision makers are looking for. What is the difference in cost over the difference in those outcomes? Okay? And this is where they come up with that economic evaluation that you often hear about. What's the incremental value? Incremental is just the difference, and what's the incremental cost effectiveness value? So what this actually means, so if you had this difference in cost, if you had this difference in outcome, where outcome is defined as quality adjusted life year, it means that so you have a drug that is more costly, but also more effective. So you have this kind of value, $26,000 per additional quality adjusted life year than drug B, so drug A, as cost effective. And there are different thresholds across different jurisdictions. So some jurisdictions have a $50,000 per quality adjusted year threshold. The UK has a £30,000 per quality adjusted year threshold. Some jurisdictions have $100,000 per. So we just start to think about that. And that's the last part, is the ranking. You do these economic evaluations, and then they actually look at them in comparison to one another. So you had this incremental, so that ICER is that incremental cost effectiveness ratio. We had 26,000 in the previous example. Where does that fit with other kinds of incremental? And that's the ranking part. And this is what your decision maker does. So a lot of work goes into coming up with how that decision is being made. So there's lots of different types of economic evaluations. It really just depends on the outcome, but it gives you a little bit of a snapshot of here are the tools, and they're the basic tools that I've shown you that people are actually looking for. So they're not doing things based on bias. They're not doing things based on opinion. They're actually trying to use the evidence to generate these economic evaluations. So that's our math, right? So here we are, differences, ratios, and ranking. So hopefully that's something that you've done. This is the P-Coder has had reviewed 42 drugs since, or as of April 17th. I've highlighted in bold the ones that are available for, or ones that have been reviewed for CLL, and they have made those, either one of those three recommendations, either list or do, list on conditional or do not list. And if we start to look at here where we are, these are some of the drugs that you're particularly interested in. What kind of decisions have they been making based on some of the tools that I've shown you? And so some of them have list with improved economic outcomes, or do not list at all, or list with improved, for again, or list as well. So it has to be believable. These are my three kids. What's believable about this, or unbelievable, is that they're Santa Claus, number one. And secondly, that I had my teenagers actually sit on Santa Claus's lap. I can't believe it. So one of the things is how believable. They often are really interested at a decision-making point of view. What is the level of evidence? So you have your great clinical trial evidence, but how good was the evidence around the costs? How good was the evidence around the resources? And how good was the incremental ratio? So how believable is it? So I hope I've given you a little bit of early math and provided you a little bit of an overview of why economic evaluations are important and the process that's in Canada and some of the data requirements involved in making that process. And now here are some references as well, and I can leave it open to questions if you have time. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was so. This is that was a great overview of a very, very difficult subject, we do have a few minutes to take some questions if there are some. I'm sure there will be. Okay, so we'll send the microphone around the room in just a few minutes. Just be nice.
Hi, I can't remember what you called the utility numbers between 0 is death and 1 is perfect health.
Yeah.
But who decides what the number is for acne versus epilepsy versus leukemia? That seems like not something that's objective.
No, so actually that particular study, and there are lots of different ways to measure utility values. So that one was done with the National Population Health Survey. There were 17,000 individuals that answered these questions using a scale. There are lots of different metrics and scales and instruments available to do that, but they just picked 20 diseases, right? But often when people are actually putting in these economic evaluations, they actually go to a cohort of people with a disease, right, and ask them that if the disease matches the particular drug that's in question, then they can actually get utility values from those individuals.
That makes more sense because people aren't very good at predicting how they would feel if they had some change of circumstance.
Yeah, and there's a whole science behind, I mean, I really simplified it, obviously, but there's a whole science behind the measurement of utility values because they're key. You remember in the ratio, they were the bottom, right? The bigger the difference, the lower your incremental ratio, the more palatable it is to a decision maker, right? The smaller the difference, right, then the incremental ratio becomes the number becomes much bigger, and then that's where roadblocks come in terms of who can fund or not fund, because that's where that ranking then comes in. So there's a whole science and lots of work going on to who's the appropriate group to measure utility values in, at what stage, prospectively, retrospectively, cross-sectionally, lots of different patients, caregivers, for example, clinicians. There's lots of work ongoing. I just showed you one little snapshot.
In Canada, for employer-sponsored insurance, typically administered by Manulife, Canada Life, and others, they've introduced lifetime caps for retirees. Are you aware of any typical number, or is there a range, or is it?
So I'm not aware of any range, but I can tell you that private insurers are now starting to do the same thing as public insurers. So I sit on a private payer board as a decision maker, and one of the things we do is look at economic evaluations as well. So in the past, they used to just sort of accept what the public system approved and not approved, and now they're actually doing their own evaluations and looking at it from the perspective of the employer as well. So that the same metrics and the same evidence and the same tools are being used there too.
So part B of the same question. I have private, corporate, catastrophic coverage, only to discover that it's $100K, right? And with ibrutinib, that's about a year and a half, or a year to year and a half. So how do you reconcile that with reality?
I have another talk on private insurance, but there are 19 publicly funded drug plans in Canada. There are 1,000 private plans, right? And so all of them make very different decisions based on their employer base and their lifetime caps and their access to medications as well. So but they're all using this kind of evidence to make those decisions.
So I had a question. Any economic evaluation, you've got to look at the money coming in as well as money going out, right? So I'm just thinking about, is there any part of your economic evaluation that talks about when people take these drugs or the treatment, keeps them out of the hospital, so it defers all those possible costs, and also gets them back working where they're paying taxes. So is that in involved at
Yeah,
any
so
point?
in one of the slides I talked about the perspectives. So sometimes they're worried about the healthcare system. So if you can avoid a hospitalization, that's counted. If you can avoid or change the length of stay, right, for someone, that's also counted. If you use the bigger perspective, the societal perspective, then you are talking about things like productivity, lost productivity, going back to work. So that is all put into those kinds of arguments about what's the cost of drug A compared to the cost of drug B. So they are considered.